The pen was in her hand, the contract was on the table, and Walter Monroe was staring at her like she had just confessed to burning his house down. "You knew," he said. His voice was low, the way thunder sounds when it is still far off but coming fast. "You knew what your father's company intends to do with this land, and you came here anyway." Theodora Lockhart did not flinch. She had trained herself not to flinch. 4 years of navigating the cutthroat legal offices of Lockhart Land Holdings in Chicago had carved the instinct right out of her. She was the company's best negotiator. She was precise, composed, and brilliant under pressure. She had finalized 43 land acquisitions across 5 territories. She did not flinch. But something about the way Walter Monroe looked at her, not with anger, not exactly, but with a kind of devastated recognition, as though he had hoped she was something different and was only now discovering she was not, made her chest tighten in a way she could not account for. "I came here to complete a legal transaction," she said. "The Monroe Ranch has been listed for sale by your bank for 3 months. Lockhart Holdings made a fair offer. You accepted the preliminary terms. I accepted the terms before I knew what Lockhart Holdings plans to build on this land." He pushed back from the table, his chair scraping across the wooden floor of his kitchen. He was tall, broader than she had expected, with the kind of weathered hands that came from actual work rather than the performance of it. His hair was dark and touched with early silver at the temples, and his jaw was set like it had been carved from the same granite the Sangre de Cristo Mountains were made of. "Before I knew that your father intends to divert the river." The words landed like a stone in still water. Theodora kept her face perfectly neutral, but inside, something shifted. "That is a development matter that falls outside the scope of this particular." "This land feeds 12 families," Walter said. He was not shouting. That was somehow worse. "The Perez family has farmed the eastern edge of my grazing land under an agreement my father made 30 years ago. The Tillman family runs a dry goods operation that depends on access through the southern pasture. The Navajo families who cross the northern ridge during the seasonal migration have done so for generations. If your father diverts the river and builds his railroad processing station, all of that ends. All of it." Theodora set the pen down. She had not meant to. Her hand made the decision before her mind did. And that small act, that single, involuntary gesture, was the beginning of the end of everything she thought she was. 3 weeks earlier, Theodora had been sitting in her father's office on the 14th floor of a building on Michigan Avenue, watching sleet streak sideways across the window glass. Harrison Lockhart was a man who had built his empire by treating the Western territories as though they were blank pages waiting to be written on. He was not cruel, exactly. He simply did not consider the people already living on those pages to be part of the story. "New Mexico Territory," he said, spreading a map across his mahogany desk. "Santa Fe County, the Monroe Ranch. 11,000 acres of prime grazing land, river access, and direct proximity to where the Denver and Rio Grande Western line is expanding south." He tapped the map with one thick finger. "I need you to go down there and close it." "You have attorneys for that," Theodora said. "I have attorneys who have already failed twice." Harrison Lockhart looked at his daughter with the particular kind of pride that was also a demand. "The rancher keeps finding technical delays. He claims the deed has encumbrances. My men can't navigate it. You can." She was 31 years old. She had a law degree from Northwestern University, one of only 6 women in her graduating class. She had never been to New Mexico Territory. She had seen the West only through the windows of trains, a smear of brown and gold and impossible sky. "When do I leave?" she asked. The train to Santa Fe took 4 days. From Santa Fe, she hired a private coach that took another day and a half south into the high desert country where the air smelled like cedar and distant rain, and something ancient she did not have a name for. She arrived in the town of Silo Rojo, population 412, according to the hand-painted sign at the edge of town, on a Tuesday afternoon in late April of 1883, dusty and stiff, and thoroughly unimpressed with the accommodations at the Silo Rojo Hotel, which offered a room barely larger than her closet in Chicago. She had 1 week to finalize the sale and return to the city, or so she believed. The Monroe Ranch was 6 miles east of town, and Theodora hired a man named Ernesto Vega to drive her out in a rented buckboard the following morning. The drive took the better part of an hour, the road cutting through land that grew more dramatically beautiful the further from town they went. She found herself leaning forward despite herself, watching the way the morning light fell across the mesa in long golden sheets, watching a hawk ride a thermal so high it became a pinprick against the deep blue sky. She had not expected it to be beautiful. She had expected a transaction. The ranch house was a solid adobe structure, single-story, with thick walls and deep-set windows and a wide covered porch that ran the full length of the front. There were horses in the near corral, and beyond them cattle visible across the slope of the near pasture, and beyond that the land rolled out in waves of sage and grass toward the mountains, and the river, the Rio Silo, a tributary of the Rio Grande, cut a silver line through the middle distance. 11,000 acres. It was, she thought with professional detachment, exceptionally fine land. Walter Monroe met her on the porch. He was not what she had expected. She had expected someone older, someone defeated, someone who had already surrendered in his heart and was only going through the motions of resistance. The bank had foreclosed on the mortgage 3 months ago. The ranch was technically in default. Monroe had 60 days before the bank forced a sale, and Lockhart Holdings had made an offer that exceeded the bank's asking price by 20%. The mathematics were clean. Walter Monroe did not look like clean mathematics. He looked like a man who had built something real and intended to protect it with every tool available to him, and he looked at Theodora with sharp brown eyes that read her thoroughly in the 3 seconds before she introduced herself. "Miss Lockhart," he said, not warmly, but not hostilely either. "Come inside, I'll put coffee on." The kitchen was the heart of the house, she saw immediately. A large cast iron stove against one wall, a heavy table in the center, shelves lined with jars and tins, a window above the sink that looked out across the south pasture. It was a working kitchen, not a decorative one. There was a child's drawing pinned to the wall beside the pantry door, a horse, she thought, or perhaps a dog, and she noticed it and quickly looked away. "You have children?" she asked before she could stop herself. He set the coffee pot on the stove and looked at her. "My nephew," he said. "He stays with me on school holidays. He's in Santa Fe with his mother right now." A pause. "His mother is my sister, Clara, in case you're cataloging the household for your files." The faint edge in his voice was warranted. She had been cataloging. It was what she did. "I apologize," she said. It was an intrusive question. He looked at her again, that same thorough reading. "Most people who come out here to take something don't apologize for their manners," he said. "It's unexpected." "I'm not here to take anything," she said. "I'm here to purchase a property that is currently in bank default." "The effect on you financially, the effect on me financially is not the concern I raised," he said. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her at the table. He sat across from her, not beside her, and he kept his hands around his own cup in a way that was somehow both casual and controlled. "Sit down, Miss Lockhart. Let me tell you something about this land before you put your pen to any paper." She sat. She told herself it was a strategic move. Let the seller talk. Let them feel heard. It smooths the transaction. She told herself that. "My father came to New Mexico in 1849, Walter said. He was 22 years old. He spoke no Spanish. He had $40 and a mule, and he came here during the gold rush madness, and then stayed because the land spoke to him in a way that California never could. He spent 30 years building this ranch. He didn't build it alone. He built it with his neighbors, with Tomás Perez, who taught him how to manage water rights in the desert, with the Navajo families who taught him where the springs ran underground and where the land would hold cattle and where it would not, with every family in Silo Rojo who is dependent on this land in ways that a map and a deed can't begin to capture. He was not performing this. She could tell the difference. In 43 acquisitions, she had heard every variation of the sentimental speech designed to raise the price or delay the inevitable. This was not that. This was a man telling her a true thing and watching to see if truth would land. "Your father's mortgage," she said carefully, "was taken out in 1879 against the projected value of the cattle expansion, which did not produce the anticipated returns, yes." He looked down at his coffee. 2 bad winters, a disease that killed a third of the herd in 1881. Bad luck compounded by bad timing. He looked back up at her. "None of which changes what this land is or who depends on it. Mr. Monroe," she kept her voice even. "The bank holds the mortgage. The bank has the legal right to sell. Lockhart Holdings has made a legitimate offer. The alternative to this sale is the bank selling the property at auction to whoever bids highest. At least with Lockhart Holdings, you have the terms my father's offer includes. You retain the ranch house and the near 10 acres around it, and you receive a settlement that allows you to what?" he said. "To watch everything my father built get turned into a railroad processing station. To watch the river get diverted so your father can service his trains. To watch 12 families lose their livelihoods because the right men in the right offices decided that this land was worth more to them empty than it is full of life." The silence after that stretched long enough to become something else entirely. She had known about the railroad processing station. She had read the development reports. She had told herself they were not her concern. Her job was land acquisition, not what came after. But sitting in Walter Monroe's kitchen, with his father's 30 years in every line of the walls and the light falling through the window across the south pasture in a way that made the grass look almost holy, the separation she had always maintained between the transaction and its consequences became suddenly, disturbingly thin. She picked up the pen. She set it back down. "I need to review some documents," she said, "before I can sign anything." Walter Monroe looked at her pen on the table, then he looked at her face. And something in his expression shifted just slightly, just barely, from resigned hostility to something that might, in a different light, have been called guarded hope. "The documents will keep," he said. "Are you hungry? I was about to make breakfast." It was the most unexpected thing he could have said, and it disarmed her completely. She stayed for breakfast. That was her first mistake. Her second mistake was letting him show her the land. After they ate scrambled eggs from his own chickens, cornbread that was better than anything she had eaten since her grandmother died, coffee that was dark enough to stand a spoon in, Walter asked her if she had seen the river yet. She said she had not. He said she should before she signed anything because the river was the heart of the whole matter and she ought to understand what she was talking about. She agreed because she told herself it was strategic. Know the asset completely. That was a principle. He saddled 2 horses, a steady bay for her that he chose with what she recognized as genuine thoughtfulness rather than condescension, and they rode out across the south pasture and through the stand of cottonwood that marked the beginning of the river corridor. The Rio Silo was not a large river. It was maybe 30 feet across at the widest point she saw, clear and fast-moving over a rocky bed, lined with cottonwood and willow and tall grasses that shivered in the spring breeze. But the water was alive in a way that the description in her father's development report had entirely failed to convey. There were birds everywhere, herons and kingfishers and smaller things she could not identify, and the sound of the water over the rocks was something that got into the chest and settled there. "The Perez family," Walter said, stopping his horse at the bank, "diverts from the river here." He pointed to a small irrigation channel cut from the bank, leading east toward the distant flat where the Perez farmland would be. "They grow corn, beans, squash. They've been doing it for 30 years. If the river gets diverted upstream for the railroad processing station, this channel runs dry. Their farm dies." Theodora looked at the channel. It was a simple thing, just a notch in the bank lined with flat stones. But it was also 30 years of feeding a family. "What are the Navajo migration patterns?" she asked. He looked at her, slightly surprised. They cross the northern ridge twice a year, spring and fall. The water from the springs on the north edge of the ranch is critical for their horses on that crossing. It's been that way since before my father came here, since before anyone who looks like me came to this part of the world. He said it without guilt but also without evasion. It's not in any deed, it's not in any legal document, but it is real. My father's development team would not consider that a legally binding encumbrance, she said. No, Walter agreed. They wouldn't. She looked at the river for a long moment. A kingfisher shot past, a blur of impossible blue. Show me the northern springs, she said. He turned his horse and she followed him north. They spent 3 hours riding the land. He showed her the northern springs, a cluster of seeps in a rocky outcropping where the water came cold and clear from underground, feeding a small pond that would indeed be critical to horses traveling a long distance. He showed her the eastern farming plots, where the Perez family was already in the field, and Tomás Perez's son Miguel rode out to meet them, a young man of maybe 25 with an easy smile that faded slightly when he saw who was riding with Walter. Walter introduced her honestly. This is Theodora Lockhart, from the company that is buying the ranch, and Miguel Perez looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has been on the receiving end of Eastern money for their entire life and knows exactly what it means. She held his gaze. You farmed this land for 30 years, she said. My father has, Miguel said. I've farmed it for 7. What would happen to your family if the irrigation channel failed? Miguel looked at Walter briefly, then back at her. We'd lose the farm. We'd have to move to Santa Fe or Albuquerque and find work there. We'd be fine, probably. But the land my father loves would not exist for us anymore. He paused. There are 3 other families in a similar situation on different parts of this ranch. We are not the only ones. She nodded. She said nothing else, but she filed every word. On the ride back to the ranch house, Walter was quiet for a long stretch. The afternoon had come on while they were riding, and the light had turned that extraordinary gold of high desert late afternoon, and the mountains had gone from brown to a deep rose color in the distance. Why are you asking these questions? Walter finally said. Because I'm a lawyer, she said. I ask questions. Most lawyers ask questions that lead toward a conclusion they've already reached, he said. You're asking questions that seem to lead somewhere genuinely uncertain. She looked ahead between her horse's ears. Maybe I am uncertain, she said. That was her third mistake, telling the truth. Because the moment she said it, something changed in the air between them. It was not dramatic. There was no thunder, no sudden touch. It was simply a shift, a slight rearrangement of the atmosphere, like when the pressure changes before a storm. Walter looked at her from beside her on his horse, and she felt his gaze the way she sometimes felt the sun after a long winter, as something that had real heat in it. She looked back at him and did not look away, and for 3 full seconds they simply looked at each other on horseback in the gold afternoon light with the mountains behind them and the Rio Silo somewhere behind that, running over its rocks in a way that had nothing to do with railroad processing stations or mortgage defaults or Lockhart holdings. Then she looked ahead again. I need to send a telegram, she said. There's a telegraph office in town, he said. I know. She did not send the telegram that evening. She told herself she was still gathering information. She told herself she was doing her professional due diligence. She told herself many things on the drive back to Silo Roja with Ernesto Vega, while the stars came out over the desert in numbers she had never seen from Chicago, so many stars that the sky seemed crowded with light. She did not sleep well. The next morning she went to the county recorder's office and spent 4 hours going through the deed history of the Monroe Ranch. She was looking for the technical encumbrances that Walter's legal team had raised and that her father's attorneys had dismissed. What she found was more complicated than either side had acknowledged. The original land grant from 1851, filed under the Treaty of Guadalupe-Hidalgo framework, contained language that created a recognized right-of-way for the Navajo seasonal migration across the northern ridge. It was not, as her father's team had claimed, a non-binding informal arrangement. It was a documented right-of-way in the original grant, which meant any development that interfered with it would require formal legal proceedings that could take years and would very likely attract the attention of the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs, which had been dramatically more active since the reforms of 1879. There was also a recorded water-sharing agreement from 1853 between the Monroe Grant and the adjacent farming parcels, which had been renewed in 1869 and again in 1877. The agreement was unambiguously binding. Diverting the river would breach it. The remedy under territorial law was injunctive relief, meaning a court could order the diversion stopped, and given the track record of territorial courts in water disputes, this was not a remote possibility. It was a likely one. Her father's development attorneys had seen these documents. She could tell, because there were notes in the margins of the copies at the recorder's office from a law firm she recognized as one of Lockhart Holdings' outside counsel. They had not reported these encumbrances accurately. They had described them as potential minor complications in their memo to her father. Theodora sat in the county recorder's office with that memo in her mind, and she felt something she had not felt in 4 years of corporate legal work. She felt the specific cold clarity of recognizing that she was being used to facilitate something she could not, with her actual training and her actual ethics, call legitimate. She walked back to her hotel and sat on the edge of her narrow bed and thought about this for a long time. Then she put on her jacket and walked to the telegraph office. She sent a wire to her father's lead attorney in Chicago. Stop. Reviewing deed encumbrances. Matter more complex than reported. Do not proceed on current timeline without MY full analysis. Lockhart. Then she walked to the Silo Rojo Hotel's small dining room and ate a bowl of the cook's postle with a piece of bread and stared at the wall and tried to decide who she was. She had not always been the person her father had shaped her into. She remembered, or tried to remember, around the edges of the professional armor, who she had been before the law degree, before the company, before the 43 acquisitions. She had been a girl who loved books and drew maps and felt the injustice of things in her chest like a physical weight. She had been a girl who had argued with her father at the dinner table about the railroad expansion and the land seizures and the displacement of communities that the newspapers called progress. He had sent her to law school, partly in pride and partly, she now understood, because a daughter with a law degree was useful. And she had let herself be useful, because usefulness was easier than the weight in her chest. Walter Monroe had given that weight back to her, and she did not know whether to thank him or resent him for it. She went back to the ranch the following morning. He was repairing a section of fence near the main gate when she arrived, and he looked up from the work with something that was not surprise, but was also not the wariness he had met her with initially. Something that was more open than that. He set down the fencing tool and came toward her. "Did you send your telegram?" he asked. "I sent a different one than I planned," she said. He studied her. "Come inside," he said. "I want to show you something." What he wanted to show her was in the room he used as a study, a small room off the main hallway, lined with shelves of books and maps and the records of the ranch going back to his father's time. He pulled a leather-bound ledger from the shelf and opened it on the desk, and she came to stand beside him without being invited to, close enough to smell the cedar and horse and clean work smell of him, and looked down at the ledger. It was an account book. Not the ranch's financial accounts, those she had already reviewed in the bank's files. This was something else. His father's handwriting and then his own in a different hand, recording every agreement, every understanding, every informal arrangement that existed between the Monroe Ranch and the surrounding community. The Perez Water Agreement, the Tillman Access Agreement, the right-of-way notes for the Navajo migration, the understanding with old Pedro Sanchez about grazing rights on the western edge. Dozens of these, going back 30 years. My father kept this because he said the law only captures what lawyers care about. Walter said. But the real agreements that make a place work are the ones people shake hands over and put their hearts into. He said a man who keeps only the legal record is only keeping half the truth. Theodora turned a page. There was an entry dated 1861 in Walter's father's handwriting, agreement with the Dene family of the North. Water at the springs, passage across the North Ridge. This is not our water to keep. This is water that passes through. We are stewards, not owners. She read it twice. How old were you when your father died? She asked. 19, Walter said. He died in 1869. I've run the ranch since then. He paused. I was 21 when the bank agreed to the original expansion loan. I thought I knew what I was doing. You were 21, she said. Almost no one knows what they're doing at 21. How old were you when you took this job? He asked. 27, she said. When I started with my father's company, I told myself I knew what I was doing. Do you? He asked. The question was not unkind. It was the question she had been asking herself since yesterday, and hearing it from him quietly, without judgment, was both unbearable and somehow exactly what she needed. I am beginning to believe I don't, she said. He looked at her. In the small study, in the afternoon light coming through the single window, they were closer than was entirely appropriate for a professional meeting between a buyer's representative and a seller. She was aware of his proximity in a way that she was not accustomed to being aware of things. She was accustomed to managing distance. Right now she did not especially want to manage it. Miss Lockhart, he said, why did you really come here? Not Lockhart Holdings. You. Why did you come yourself instead of sending another attorney? She should have had a smooth answer. She had given smooth answers to harder questions in depositions and boardrooms for 4 years. But the weight in her chest that Walter Monroe had given back to her was pressing outward, and the smooth answer would not come. Because I'm good at this, she said, and I stopped asking myself whether good at something was a sufficient reason to do it. She looked at the ledger, still open on the desk. And I think I needed to stop not asking. The silence that followed was different from the silences before. Those had been silences of negotiation and assessment. This one was something else. Something warmer and considerably more dangerous. I'm going to make supper, Walter said, and I'd like it if you stayed. She stayed. Supper was simple beans cooked with dried chili peppers and chunks of pork. Tortillas from a supply he traded for in town, sliced tomatoes. He cooked it with the same unhurried competence he seemed to bring to everything, and they sat at the kitchen table as the evening came down outside, and the coyotes started somewhere off in the distance, and they talked. They talked about his father and the early days of the ranch. They talked about her childhood in Chicago, which she found herself describing honestly rather than the polished version she usually gave. They talked about the law. She was startled to discover he had read Blackstone and several volumes of territorial law and had a clearer understanding of his own legal situation than most clients she encountered. They talked about the land. I don't want to lose it, he said. It was not defensive when he said it. It was simply true. Not because it's mine, because it is what it is. You wrote it today. You saw what it is. I did, she said. Would your father be able to look at that and see what you saw? She considered it honestly. My father sees land in terms of what it can produce, she said. He is not a malicious man. He simply has a very limited field of vision. A lot of damage in this world is done by people with limited fields of vision, Walter said. Yes, she agreed. It is. After supper she helped him wash the dishes, which was not something she had done in 4 years. The company apartment in Chicago had a housekeeper, and the domestic ordinariness of standing at his sink with a dish towel while he washed was oddly affecting. She kept thinking she should be going. She kept not going. I'll need to write a full report for my father, she said, drying a plate, with my actual legal analysis of the encumbrances, not what his attorneys told him. What will he do with that? Walter asked. He'll be angry, she said. He may try to work around the encumbrances anyway. There are ways to do it legally if you're willing to spend enough money and enough time. But he will have to be honest about what he's doing and why. He won't be able to pretend it's simple. And what will you do? He asked. She set the plate on the shelf. "I don't know yet," she said. He turned from the sink and looked at her directly, and she looked back at him, and there it was again, that rearrangement of the air between them, that change in pressure. "I think you know," he said, gently, not a challenge. A simple observation, the way he had talked about everything tonight, as though the truth was a thing that deserved the same quiet respect as the land outside. She felt something she had not felt in a very long time, a fear that was also an ache, the specific vulnerability of being seen accurately by someone whose opinion had somehow, in the space of 48 hours, come to matter. "I should get back to town," she said. "I'll have Ernesto drive you," he said. "It's late," she said. "He'll be asleep." "He lives next door to the livery," Walter said. "He won't mind." He sent for Ernesto Vega, and while they waited on the porch for the buckboard, the night was enormous around them, the desert night sky in New Mexico in April. More stars than she had thought existed, the warm air carrying the smell of sage and the distant water. "I'll come back tomorrow," she said. "I need to look at a few more documents." "I'll have coffee ready," he said. She looked at him in the starlight. He was looking at her too, and the expression on his face was careful and real and complicated, and she thought about the ledger of handshake agreements, and his father's note about being stewards, not owners, and she felt the distinct and terrifying sensation of something in her own careful, armored interior beginning to shift. "Good night, Mr. Monroe," she said. "Good night, Miss Lockhart," he said. The buckboard came, and she rode back to Silo Rojo under the enormous stars, and she did not sleep at all. She spent the next morning drafting her legal analysis at the small desk in her hotel room. It was meticulous and honest and damaging to her father's plans, a thorough catalog of every encumbrance, every binding agreement, every legal risk that Lockhart Holdings was incurring by proceeding with the current development plan. She wrote it with the same precision she had always brought to her work, but with a different purpose underneath. Not to smooth the transaction, to report the truth. She was halfway through it when a knock came at her door. The man standing in the hall was not someone she recognized. He was well dressed in the Eastern style that looked out of place in Silo Rojo, with a waxed mustache and a traveling case. He introduced himself as James Pryor, associate counsel for Lockhart Holdings. Her father had sent someone to check on her. "Your telegram caused some concern in Chicago," Pryor said, once she had let him in, and he had looked around her small room with the expression of a man who found his current circumstances beneath him. "Mr. Lockhart asked me to come and assist with any complications." "I don't need assistance," she said. "I am managing the matter. The timeline. The timeline I communicated is my professional assessment of what is legally sound," she said. "If my father wants to proceed on a faster timeline, he can explain to a territorial court why he disregarded binding water agreements from 1853. Pryor looked at her with the particular expression of a man who had been told things about her sharp, capable, the boss's daughter, difficult to manage, and was now calibrating his approach. "Miss Lockhart," he said, "your father has invested considerable resources in this acquisition. The railroad contract depends on having this land under Lockhart Holdings' control by June. If we miss that window, then we miss it," she said. "The alternative is a lawsuit that drags on for 3 years and costs 10 times what a proper legal approach costs now. Your father sees it differently." "My father doesn't have the documents in front of him," she said. "I do. I will complete my analysis and transmit it to Chicago. My recommendation will be to renegotiate the terms of the development plan to accommodate the existing encumbrances. That is the legally sound and commercially reasonable path." Pryor studied her. "And if your father declines that recommendation," she met his gaze steadily, "then I will resign from this matter," she said, "and he can send someone else." The words came out of her mouth with a clarity that surprised her. She had not consciously decided to say them. They came from the same place that had made her put down the pen the day before, from the weight in her chest that was no longer a weight she was willing to carry without naming. Pryor left with the air of a man who would be sending a telegram of his own. She finished her analysis that afternoon and sent it to Chicago by the evening wire. Then she walked to the livery, arranged for Ernesto Vega to drive her to the Monroe ranch the following morning, and went back to the hotel and sat on the porch in the cooling evening air watching the people of Silo Rojo go about the end of their day. She watched the blacksmith close his shop and go home to his family. She watched a woman hanging laundry in the last of the light. She watched two men sitting outside the barber shop playing checkers. She thought about what Walter had said, that a lot of damage is done by people with limited fields of vision, and she thought about whether she had been one of those people, and she thought the honest answer was yes, for a while, and she thought about what it meant to stop being one. It meant loss. That was the thing about expanding your field of vision. You saw more, including the damage you had been complicit in not seeing, and that was not comfortable. But the alternative, the narrowness, the smooth answers, the pen always ready, was something she could not go back to. Not after the ledger with its handshake agreements. Not after the Rio Silo over its rocks with the kingfisher flashing past. Not after Walter Monroe looking at her and asking if she knew what she was doing. The next morning Ernesto drove her out to the ranch, and Walter was on the porch with coffee when she arrived, as he had said he would be. He handed her a cup when she climbed the porch steps, and their fingers brushed in the handoff, and neither of them said anything about it, but the air shifted in that way it kept doing. "I sent my analysis to Chicago last night," she said. "What did it say?" "That the encumbrances are real, binding, and legally significant. That the development plan as currently structured would create substantial litigation risk. That the commercially sound path is to restructure the terms to work with the encumbrances rather than around them." Walter held his coffee cup with both hands and looked at her. "And your father? He sent one of his attorneys yesterday to try to persuade me to accelerate the timeline," she said. "I told him no." A pause. "I told him if my father declined my recommendation, I would resign from the matter." The silence that followed this was different from any of the previous silences. It carried weight and significance, and something that was close to tenderness. "That is a significant thing to say," Walter said. "Yes," she agreed, "it is." He looked at her for a long moment. The morning was clear and warm, the mountains brilliant against the blue sky, a meadowlark somewhere in the pasture making its liquid sound. "Would you like to ride again?" he said. "Yes," she said, "I would." They rode west that morning, into a part of the ranch she had not seen, where the land rose gradually toward the base of the mesa, and the rock formations became larger and more dramatic, red and orange sandstone in shapes that the wind and water had made over unimaginable time. They stopped at the top of a low ridge and looked back east across the whole sweep of the ranch, and from this height she could see the river corridor cutting its silver line, and the distant green patch of the Perez farmland, and the small cluster of buildings that was Silo Rojo 6 miles off. "From up here you can see the whole thing," Walter said. "Every part of it connected to every other part. The river feeds the farms, feeds the town. The grazing feeds the cattle, feeds the markets, feeds the railroad that your father wants to use this land for." He looked at her. "The railroad is not wrong to want access. The connection is real. But the question is whether you build it by destroying the smaller connections or by honoring them. That is a more sophisticated position than most development arguments I've encountered," she said. "I've had a lot of time to think about it," he said. 3 years of watching this coming and knowing I might not be able to stop it." "What would you want?" she said. "In an ideal outcome, if you could design the terms." He turned in his saddle to face her more directly. The wind moved her hair, which she had loosened slightly from its morning arrangement, and his gaze moved to it briefly before returning to her face with a quality of attention she was beginning to recognize as one of his essential characteristics, a full, unhurried presence, like the land itself. "I want to keep the ranch," he said. "Not all of it, necessarily. If Lockhart Holdings genuinely needs land for a processing station, there are 11,000 acres here. A station doesn't require 11,000 acres. I want the river protected. I want the water agreements honored. I want the right-of-way on the North Ridge formalized properly so it cannot be undone by the next lawyer who comes through. He paused. And I want the Perez family's water secure, not as a favor, as a legal certainty. Theodora was writing in the small notebook she had taken to carrying since the first day on the ranch. She looked up from it. That is actually a workable framework, she said. My father would not like it, but it could be made to work legally. Would you make it work? He asked. I think I might, she said. He looked at her with something that was full and direct and warm enough to make her feel the strange, forgotten sensation of being truly looked at by someone who was genuinely interested in what they were seeing. Not in what she represented, not in what she could do for them. In her. Theodora, he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name, and the sound of it in his voice was like the meadowlark had been liquid and clear and carrying across the open air. She should have redirected the conversation. She knew exactly the professional mechanism for doing so. Walter, she said instead. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. Below them, across the vast, beautiful open land, the Rio Silo caught the morning sun and threw it back as light. I need to tell you something, he said, and I need you to know it has nothing to do with the land sale. It is entirely separate from that, and I will not let it be otherwise. Tell me, she said. I have not met anyone like you in a very long time, he said. I do not mean that as a way of making this transaction more complicated. I mean it as a simple, true thing that I needed to say because I do not have the habit of keeping true things to myself. She looked at him. The notebook in her hand was suddenly irrelevant. Everything about her professional self, the armor, the distance, the smooth answers was entirely irrelevant. I have not met anyone like you either, she said, and I have been trying to decide what to do with that since the first morning. What have you decided? He asked. That I am not ready to leave, she said, which is both an answer and a problem because I was supposed to have this finalized a week ago and return to Chicago. What happens if you don't return to Chicago? He asked. My father will be furious, she said. He will say I have gone native, which is what he says about anyone who develops a concern for the people his company displaces. May try to remove me from the matter. He may succeed. She looked at the river in the distance. None of those things seemed to me like sufficient reasons to get on a train. Walter was quiet for a moment. Then, I want to be careful here, he said. I am a man with a mortgage in default and a land dispute and no business adding to anyone else's complications. I'm a lawyer with a conflict of interest and a father I'm in the process of defying, she said. We are both in complicated positions. Is that what this is? He said. A complication? She looked at him squarely. No, she said. I don't think it is. The smile that crossed his face then was not the guarded thing she had seen in the first days. It was real and unguarded, and it altered his whole face, and she felt it like sun after a long winter again, warm and too real to look away from. Come back to the ranch tonight, he said. My sister Clara brings my nephew back from Santa Fe this afternoon. She has been asking to meet the woman from Chicago who has been asking all the inconvenient questions. You've been talking to your sister about me. She said, Clara has a gift for extracting information, he said, and she has been curious since my first letter. The ride back to the ranch house was easier and quieter than any of the rides before, the easy quiet of people who have said something true and are letting it settle. When they came into the yard, a wagon was already there, and a woman was climbing down from it with the help of a boy of maybe 7 or 8 who was clearly Walter's nephew from the way he carried himself, the same unhurried self-possession in miniature. Clara Monroe was 35, dark-haired, lively-eyed, and she looked at Theodora with the very direct frankness of a woman who makes quick and accurate assessments. She shook Theodora's hand firmly. You're the one who's been making my brother think, she said. He was becoming insufferably resigned before you arrived. Clara, Walter said. I'm complimenting her, Clara said. The nephew was named Charles Monroe Voss, after his uncle and his father's family, and he attached himself to Walter immediately in the way of a child who adores someone thoroughly, and Walter swung him up with an ease that said this was an old familiar motion between them. Charlie looked at Theodora with the frank scrutiny of small children and said, "Are you the lady who's trying to buy the ranch?" "I was," Theodora said. "It is becoming more complicated than that." Charlie considered this. "Walter says complicated is usually more interesting than simple," he said. "He is correct," Theodora said. Clara stayed for supper. She had brought supplies from Santa Fe, a cured ham, a tin of peaches, real coffee, and she organized the kitchen with the authority of someone who had helped run it for years. And Theodora found herself recruited into the effort with an ease that was both unexpected and pleasant. Clara was warm and funny and asked questions that were perceptive and personal without being intrusive, and Theodora found herself answering honestly, which was becoming a habit. "What will you do?" Clara asked, while the men were outside and Charlie was allegedly feeding the chickens but was probably doing something more exciting. "If the sale falls through or gets restructured." "I don't know yet," Theodora said. "My whole professional life has been built around this company. I don't know what it looks like outside of it." "That is terrifying and also very freeing," Clara said. "I know because I left Santa Fe to go to Albuquerque after my husband died, and everyone told me I was making a mistake, and I was, but the mistake was also the best thing that happened to me because it led somewhere I could never have planned." She looked at Theodora steadily. "Walter has not looked at anyone the way he looks at you in 6 years." Theodora kept her hands busy with the peaches. "It's complicated," she said. "Everything real is," Clara said. "That is not a reason to run from it." Supper was the best evening Theodora had spent in years, though she did not articulate this to herself until much later. There was food and lamplight and a boy named Charlie falling asleep at the table and being carried to the spare room by his uncle. And there was laughter, actual laughter and conversation that went from serious to silly and back without ceremony. And there was the feeling foreign to her, half forgotten, of being somewhere she belonged. After Clara and Charlie were settled, Walter walked Theodora to the porch to wait for Ernesto, who came later than expected, and they stood in the darkness with the stars overhead and the coyotes in the distance, and Walter said, "I am going to ask you something and I need you to tell me if it is too much." "Ask," she said. "Stay in Silo Rojo for another 2 weeks," he said. "Not for the land sale, for yourself. See what this place is with time enough to actually see it, and see what this is." He gestured slightly between them. "Whatever this is," she looked at the stars. The ache in her chest was not uncomfortable now. It was the ache of something expanding rather than contracting. "I'll need to send another telegram," she said. "The telegraph office opens at 8, he said. "Then I suppose I'll be staying," she said. He reached out and took her hand carefully, the way he did everything, with full attention, and held it for a moment. His hand was warm and real, and she felt every callus and every line of it. Then he let go, just as Ernesto's lantern appeared at the end of the drive. She walked to the buckboard feeling like the ground was slightly different under her feet than it had been that morning. The following days were a kind of life she had never led before. She sent the telegram to her father extending stay for full legal due diligence. Analysis transmitted. Await response. And she did genuine legal work, because there was genuine legal work to be done. But she also rode the land and walked the town and ate at Clara's kitchen table and watched Charlie try to teach Walter's dog to carry a stick, which the dog found philosophically objectionable. She met Tomás Perez, the elder, a man in his late 60s with a face full of the history of this country and a handshake that meant something. He showed her his fields with pride and practicality, walking the irrigation channels with her, while his son Miguel translated occasionally when Tomás' English failed, though his English was better than he let on. He showed her what 30 years of careful farming had produced in this desert and what the water meant to it. She met Emma Tillman, who ran the dry goods store with her husband Jack, and who explained in direct and practical terms what access through the southern Monroe pasture meant for their supply routes. Emma was small and sharp, and had the air of someone who has built something from nothing and intends to keep it. She attended a Sunday meeting at the small church in Silo Rojo and was struck by the way the community it represented Anglo settlers and Mexican families, and everyone who had made this particular corner of the territory their home existed in genuine interdependence, the kind that the ledger of handshake agreements in Walter's study had tried to capture in ink. And she spent time with Walter. Every day, she spent time with Walter. They rode in the mornings and talked in the evenings and argued productively about law and land use and territorial policy. And they played chess at the kitchen table after Clara put Charlie to bed. And Walter won 3 times and she won twice. And the 5th game ended in a draw that both of them called a moral victory. She noticed everything about him. The way he thought before he spoke. Not the cautious pause of someone managing their words, but the genuine pause of someone who wanted to say the true thing. The way he was with Charlie, patient and funny and real, not performing unclehood but being it. The way he talked about his father's legacy, not as a burden or an obligation, but as something he genuinely revered and wanted to carry forward faithfully. The way he listened to her, actually listened, with the same full, unhurried presence he gave the land. She was falling in love with him. She recognized it with the precision of a lawyer examining evidence. The facts were clear, the conclusion was unavoidable. The only question was what to do with it, given that she lived in Chicago and he lived in New Mexico territory and her father's company was in the process of trying to buy his ranch. On the 9th day of her extended stay, the response came from Chicago. It came in 2 parts. The first was a telegram from her father, analysis reviewed. Proposal to restructure development terms unacceptable. Timeline requires original plan. Finalize or return. The second was a letter from James Pryor, which had come by fast post and arrived the same day. Miss Lockhart, your father has instructed me to advise you that if you cannot finalize the Monroe acquisition on the original terms within 5 days, he will assign the matter to outside counsel and consider your position with the company concluded. He asks me to also advise that any decision you make has professional consequences beyond your current employment. I urge you to consider the implications carefully before proceeding. She read both twice. She sat with them for an hour in her hotel room, which she had come to think of as a temporary and insufficient place to be. Then she walked to the ranch. Walter was in the stable when she arrived, working on a horse's shoe with the smith from town who came out twice a month. He saw her expression and finished what he was doing and then came to her, and she gave him the telegram and the letter without preface. He read them. His face went very still in that way she had come to understand was not indifference but concentration. This is a forced choice, he said. Yes, she said. Your father is asking you to choose between him and your own legal judgment, he said. And between your professional position and he stopped. And this, she said, whatever this is, he looked at her. What do you want to do, he said. I want to find a third option, she said. I always want to find a third option. It's a lawyer thing. Is there one? Maybe, she said. I have been thinking about this since yesterday before the telegram arrived because I could see it coming. There's a possible third option that involves me no longer representing Lockhart Holdings, but independently facilitating a mediated restructuring of the terms through the territorial court, with the encumbrances properly recorded, and the development plan modified to a partial sale of approximately 2,000 acres of the southwest parcel, which has no water dependency and no migration routes, for a modified processing facility. It protects the river, the farms, the North Ridge. It gives the railroad access. It is less than what my father wants, but more than nothing. Walter had been listening with that full attention. That is a complicated third option, he said. Yes, she said. It requires me to resign from Lockhart Holdings. What does it require from me? He asked. It requires you to trust me, she said, working on your behalf rather than my father's. The directness of that, the vulnerability of it, landed between them with real weight. She was asking him to trust her. After everything, After she had arrived as the representative of the company that was trying to take his land, after all the professional distance and the contracts and the pen on the table, she was asking him to trust her with the thing that mattered most to him. He took both her hands in his. She felt the warmth of them all the way through. "I have trusted you since the day you put the pen down," he said. "I was just waiting for you to catch up." She laughed. It came out of her in a way that felt like something releasing, like a spring flood after a long winter, and he laughed too, and they stood in the yard of his ranch in the warm New Mexico spring with their hands joined, laughing, while the horses watched them with the mild indifference of horses. "I need to write to my father," she said, when the laughter settled. "Write whatever you need to write," he said. "The study is yours." She spent the rest of that afternoon in his study at his father's desk, writing the letter. It was the most difficult letter she had ever written, including the one she had written to her mother after the funeral, and the one she had written to her law school dean, when she had been accused of favoritism for helping a less privileged student with his application. It was the letter of a daughter telling a powerful father that she had found the limit of what she would do for him, and it was also the letter of a professional resigning a position with a clarity that came from having found something more important than the position. She wrote honestly and completely. She told him about the encumbrances. She told him about the community the land supported. She told him about the third option, the partial sale, the modified development plan. She told him that she believed it was in Lockhart Holdings' genuine long-term interest, not just morally but commercially, because the alternative litigation would be ruinous. And she told him at the end that she was staying in New Mexico territory, and that she was sorry if this was not what he had hoped for her, but that she hoped he would come to understand. She sent the letter and the formal document of her resignation as a Lockhart Holdings representative by the Evening Post. Then she walked back to the kitchen where Walter was making supper, and Clara was at the table telling Charlie something about the history of Santa Fe that he was partially listening to, and she sat down at the table and felt the simplicity and rightness of being exactly where she was. "Done?" Walter asked from the stove. "Done," she said. Clara looked at her over Charlie's head with a knowing expression that Theodora returned with a small, private smile. The weeks that followed were the process of rebuilding something. Or building something new. She established herself in Silo Rojo as an independent attorney, the second qualified attorney in town, the first woman attorney in the county, a distinction that caused genuine consternation at the county recorder's office, and considerably more excitement among the women of the town, who quickly discovered that she was available and competent and not afraid of difficult matters. She rented a small office above the dry goods store from Emma and Jack Tillman, who charged her a fair rate and gave her a key with the solemnity of people performing a historically significant act, which in the context of Silo Rojo's legal history it somewhat was. She filed the formal mediation request with the territorial court in Santa Fe, citing the documented encumbrances and requesting supervised negotiation of amended terms for the Monroe Lockhart transaction. The territorial judge, a man named Hargrove who had a reputation for fairness in water disputes, accepted the filing and set a mediation date 6 weeks out. Her father responded to her letter with a telegram that said, "Deeply disappointed, stop PRYOR, handling matter stop, do not expect reversal of consequences," and which she read standing in the telegraph office, and then folded and put in her jacket pocket without outward display, and walked to the livery and cried briefly and privately before washing her face with the water from the trough, which was cold and bracing, and then going to her office to work. The grief of it was real. Her father was not a monster. He was a limited man who loved her in the limited way available to him, and she had disappointed him in the way that mattered most to him, and that was a loss she did not minimize. She simply no longer let it be the deciding factor. She told Walter about it that evening. They had fallen into an easy rhythm of evening time together, supper at the ranch or dinner at the hotel, walks in the cooling air, long conversations on the porch. He listened to the grief in her voice without trying to fix it, which was exactly the right response. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "No," she said, "not the decision. I regret the cost of it, which is different." "What would make it easier?" he asked. She looked at him. The evening star had appeared over the mountains, the first one out, brilliant and solitary. "This," she said simply, "being here, this makes it easier." He reached across the porch rail and took her hand again, and this time he did not let go after a moment. He held on, and she held on, and they watched the stars come out one by one over the desert in the slowly deepening dark. He kissed her for the first time on a Thursday evening 2 weeks after she had sent her resignation letter. They were walking back from the river. She had gone to look at the irrigation channels again in relation to the mediation documents she was preparing, and they were coming through the cottonwood corridor when she stopped to watch a great blue heron standing absolutely still in the shallows, and Walter stopped beside her, and they stood watching the heron together. And when she turned to say something about the stillness of it, he was already looking at her, not at the heron, and the expression on his face was everything. The kiss was careful, and then it was not careful. It was full and warm and tasted of the coffee they had drunk an hour ago, and something that was just him. Just Walter Monroe at 33 years old with 30 years of this land in his hands, and his father's truth-keeping in his bones, and the specific courage of a man who does not have the habit of keeping true things to himself. She kissed him back with everything she had, and the heron eventually lost patience with the disruption and lifted itself into the air with enormous slow wing beats and disappeared upriver. And they stood in the cottonwood corridor beside the Rio Silo with their arms around each other and the warm spring air around them, and she thought she understood now why his father had said they were stewards, not owners. You did not own a moment like this. You were simply given the use of it, and it was your obligation to honor what it was. "I am in love with you," Walter said, against her hair. "I have been trying to find the right moment to say that, and I think there is no right moment. There is only the moment when it becomes impossible not to say. I am in love with you too," she said. "I am fairly certain I have been since the first morning you made me breakfast, which is embarrassingly fast." He laughed. "It was very good breakfast," he said. "It was exceptional," she agreed. The mediation in Santa Fe was set for a Wednesday in late June, and they drove up together by wagon Walter, Theodora, and Clara, who insisted on coming because she said she was not going to sit in Silo Rojo waiting for news when she could be in Santa Fe being useful, and Charlie came because there was no school and he wanted to see the city. James Pryor came from Chicago for Lockhart Holdings, which Theodora had expected. What she had not expected was her father himself, who arrived on the Saturday before the Wednesday mediation and walked into the hotel dining room where she was eating breakfast with Walter, and looked at the two of them at the table together, with an expression that moved through several complex stages in rapid succession. Harrison Lockhart was 61 years old and built like a man who had once been powerful, and was now simply large, with a white beard he had grown since she last saw him, and the same sharp eyes she saw in her own mirror every morning. He sat down without being invited, looked at Walter with the assessment of a man used to measuring other men, and then looked at his daughter. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "This is Monroe," he said. "Walter Monroe," Walter said, and extended his hand. Her father looked at it and then shook it, which she took as a moderately good sign. What followed was not easy, but it was honest. Harrison Lockhart was a man who responded better to directness than to anything else, and over the course of that breakfast and a long walk through the plaza afterward, Theodora laid out for him, not as a daughter managing a difficult father, but as a lawyer making a case, the full picture of what his development plan would cost in legal risk and community damage and reputational harm to Lockhart Holdings in a territory where the company would need to operate for years to come. She also laid out the alternative, the partial sale, the modified facility, the protected river and the protected encumbrances properly recorded. the legal certainty that would come from a clean title rather than one perpetually at risk of challenge. Harrison Lockhart listened. He was not a fool, whatever else he was. He had built a considerable empire on his ability to read situations accurately, and the situation Theodora laid before him was one where the easy path was demonstrably more expensive than the harder one. "The railroad contract needs a facility by next spring," he said. "The southwest parcel gives you a facility site by next spring," she said. "It is smaller than your original plan but adequate for phase 1 of the processing operation. If it proves insufficient, there are adjacent parcels, not the Monroe land, that could be acquired without encumbrance in phase 2. Harrison Lockhart looked at Walter. "You'd accept a partial sale, 2,000 acres of the southwest parcel, with the water agreements and the North Ridge right-of-way formally registered as deed restrictions running with the land," Walter said, "and the price adjusted for partial acreage at the full valuation rate, not discounted for the restrictions." Her father drummed his fingers on the arm of the bench they were sitting on. "Pryor is going to tell me this is a bad deal," he said. "Pryor's job is to get you the maximum advantage in any transaction," Theodora said. "My job is to tell you when the maximum advantage creates maximum risk. Those are different functions." He looked at her for a long moment. "You've been out here 2 months," he said. "You look different." "I feel different," she said. His eyes moved to Walter briefly, then back to her. He was not a man who expressed feeling easily, but she saw something in his face that was not entirely displeasure. Something that might, under better circumstances, have been called recognition. "Fine," he said. "Bring me the terms." The mediation on Wednesday ran for 4 hours, with Judge Hargrove presiding and both parties' attorneys present, Pryor for Lockhart Holdings and Theodora, now formally representing Walter as his attorney, on the other side, which caused Pryor visible discomfort and Judge Hargrove visible amusement. At the end of the 4 hours, they had an agreement. 2,000 acres of the southwest Monroe parcel, at full valuation. The Rio Silo water agreements recorded as deed restrictions in perpetuity. The North Ridge right-of-way, formally registered with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and recorded in the county deed. The Perez and Tillman access agreements formalized in legal instruments that would survive any future sale of the remaining Monroe land. Walter Monroe signed it with steady hands. Theodora Lockhart witnessed it. Afterward, standing on the steps of the territorial courthouse in the June sunshine, Harrison Lockhart shook Walter Monroe's hand again, and this time the shake lasted longer. "You have a good advocate," her father said, with a look at Theodora. "The best," Walter said. Harrison Lockhart looked at his daughter one more time with that complicated expression. "Come see me in Chicago," he said, "when you're ready." "I will," she said, and she meant it. He left for Chicago the following morning. She watched his carriage pull away from the hotel and felt the grief again, the cost of her choices, but steadier now, with the settlement agreement in hand and Walter's shoulder warm against hers as they stood on the hotel steps watching the carriage go. "He is not a villain," Walter said. "No," she agreed. "He is a man who loves me in the only way he knows how, and I love him in the full way, which means loving the flawed actual person rather than who he ought to be." "That is very wise," Walter said. "I have a very good teacher," she said, and looked at him, and he smiled in that real, full, unguarded way. The drive back to Silo Rojo was long and golden, and Charlie fell asleep between Walter and Clara on the wagon seat, and had to be transferred to the back where he arranged himself among the blankets with boneless childhood ease. Clara sat up front with Ernesto Vega to give Theodora and Walter the wagon bed, and they sat together in the back with their backs against the side rail, and the mountains going gold in the evening light, and the road running southwest through the sage. And Walter put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and felt the whole complicated and beautiful tangle of everything that had brought her here. "I want to ask you something," Walter said. "And I need you to know it is not connected to the land sale or the mediation or any of the practical things we have just accomplished." She looked up at him. The evening star was appearing again above the mountains, that same first brilliant point of light. "Ask," she said. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not because you've resigned your position and need somewhere to be, not because it's practical. Because I love you and I want to build something with you, and what we would build together seems to me like something worth building." The ache in her chest was enormous and warm and entirely good. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He kissed her temple, and she tucked her head against his shoulder, and Charlie snored softly among the blankets, and Clara up front laughed at something Ernesto said, and the wagon rolled through the desert in the golden evening, and the Rio Silo was somewhere ahead of them, running over its rocks in the old dark, and everything that had been broken or compromised or hidden by fear was, in that moment, simply and completely healed. They were married in September of 1883 in the church at Silo Rojo, in a ceremony that was attended by what appeared to be the entire population of the county, including Tomás Perez, who wore his best coat and wept openly and unashamedly, and Emma Tillman, who organized the reception with the same focused efficiency she brought to the dry goods store, and Charlie, who served as ring bearer with great solemnity and tripped once on the church steps but recovered with dignity. Harrison Lockhart came from Chicago. He sat in the front pew with Clara, who he appeared to find both exhausting and delightful in equal measure, and he brought a wedding gift of a handsome clock for the ranch house and a private letter to Theodora that she read the night before the wedding and that said, in part, "I do not fully understand all of your choices, but I see you are happy, and I know that your mother would have approved of this man, which is the only endorsement that matters." She kept the letter. The ranch was different after the settlement. Not dramatically, the land was the same land, the river ran in its same channel, the cattle grazed the same pastures, but there was a different quality to the permanence of it. The southwest parcel was surveyed and transferred to Lockhart Holdings, and construction on the processing facility began in early autumn, the sounds of it reaching the ranch house faintly on quiet mornings, a reminder of what had been negotiated rather than taken. Walter had taken the settlement money and cleared the mortgage entirely, and the relief of that, the particular physical relaxation of a man who has been carrying a weight for years, was visible in him in a way that made Theodora ache with tenderness. She built her law practice in Silo Rojo through the autumn and into winter, and it turned out that there was considerable demand for a competent attorney in a small town, particularly one who was known to fight hard for the people she represented. She handled water disputes and property lines and the occasional criminal matter, and 2 cases involving women seeking legal remedy for situations that the law technically addressed but practically overlooked, and she won both of them, and word traveled in the way that word travels in small places. She was happy. It was a simple and astonishing fact. She had spent 4 years being competent and driven and professionally successful and thoroughly, quietly unhappy, and now she lived in a house she loved on land she had come to love, married to a man she loved with a depth that still sometimes caught her off guard in the middle of ordinary moments, watching him across the breakfast table, watching him with Charlie, watching him stand at the pasture fence at the end of the day looking out at his land with his father's steadiness and his own hard-won peace. The Rio Silo process station went up on the southwest parcel and began operating in the spring of 1884, and the manager Lockhart Holdings sent a practical man from Denver named Garrison. Came to Walter early on to discuss some drainage questions that the initial survey had missed, and Walter and Theodora sat down with him and worked out a solution that was both technically sound and consistent with the water agreements. And Garrison went back to Denver saying that the Monroe people were reasonable, which in the language of railroad contractors was high praise. Tomás Perez's irrigation channel ran clean. The Navajo families crossed the North Ridge in the spring and the fall as they always had. Emma Tillman received her deliveries through the Southern Pasture Access Road, now formally recorded and paved with crushed rock by Walter in the autumn of 1883, as a gesture that was both practical and symbolic. In the spring of 1885, Theodora and Walter's first child was born. A boy, which delighted Charlie, now 9 and very opinionated about the subject, who had been lobbying for a boy since he had learned there was a baby coming. They named him James Monroe, after Walter's father, whose name had been James, and because the name carried a weight of honest history that both of them felt. Theodora had continued to work through her pregnancy, something that raised eyebrows among certain elements of Silo Rojo, and raised no eyebrows at all among the elements she cared about. She was in the office above the dry goods store, drafting a water rights brief 3 days before James was born, which Emma Tillman considered entirely sensible and the county clerk considered entirely alarming. James was born healthy and loud and emphatic about his opinions from the first moment, which Walter said came from his mother, and Theodora said came from his father, and Clara said came from both of them equally, which was probably true. Life arranged itself around the new shape. Mornings at the ranch, evenings at the ranch, the law office 3 days a week when James was small and more as he grew, Clara coming down from Albuquerque for long visits that were genuinely missed when they ended, Charlie growing from a solemn 9-year-old into a self-possessed 12-year-old who had decided he was going to be a veterinarian and applied himself to the study of horses with the same thoroughness his uncle applied to everything. In the autumn of 1886, Harrison Lockhart visited for the second time, and this visit was longer and quieter than the first. He held his grandson James with the careful reverence of a man who has discovered late in life that there are things more important than commerce, and he took long walks with Walter on the land that had been the center of their conflict. And on the last evening of his visit, he sat at Walter's kitchen table after supper and looked at the two of them across it and said, "I owe you both an apology." It was not easy for him to say. She could see what it cost him. She also saw Walter receive it with the same uncomplicated dignity he received everything, not extracting additional concession from the admission, not letting the apology become a transaction. "You've been making it right for 3 years," Walter said. "The Garrison drainage solution, the additional easement you filed in Santa Fe last year for the Perez North Field, you've been paying attention." Harrison Lockhart looked at his daughter. "He's observant," he said. "He is," she agreed. "It is one of many excellent things about him." Her father stayed 4 days more, and when he left differently than he had come. Something had been repaired that Theodora had not been entirely sure could be repaired, and the repair was imperfect in the way all real repairs are, with the cracks still visible and the history still present. But it held. It held because all the people involved in it had chosen to let it hold, which was the only way anything ever did. She was pregnant with their second child when the winter of 1887 came in cold and early. She was not worried. She was healthy. The pregnancy was easy. The midwife in Silo Rojo was experienced and calm. But the winter brought its own intensity, the ranch drawing inward around its core of light and warmth while the high desert cold pressed at the windows. And there was something about those winter months that she would remember for the rest of her life as a particular kind of perfection. A time when everything she needed was contained in the radius of the kitchen fire, the familiar sounds of the ranch settling around them, Walter reading at the table while she worked on documents, James asleep in his room down the hall. "Tell me something," she said one evening, looking up from her papers. He looked up from his book. "What do you want to know?" "What you thought when you first saw me drive up in that buckboard," she said. "The very first thing." He was quiet for a moment with the honest pause she loved. "I thought you were going to be harder to say no to than the others," he said, "because you had a different quality of attention than the others. They looked at the land and saw acreage. You looked at the land and saw it." "I didn't realize I was doing that," she said. "No," he said. "That's what made it true." She looked at him across the table, this man who had made her put down the pen, who had fed her scrambled eggs and shown her the river and given her back the weight in her chest and made her understand why keeping it was better than setting it down. who had kissed her in the cottonwood corridor in the spring light while a heron watched, who had built something with his father's hands that he kept faith with every day. "I came here to finalize a land sale," she said, "and you made me question everything." "I'm sorry about that," he said. "You are not," she said. He smiled. "No," he agreed, "I am not." "I'm not either," she said, "not one bit." The second child was born in February of 1888, another boy, who they named Thomas after Tomás Perez, who had been at this ranch 30 years before Walter Monroe had taken it over from his father, and who accepted the honor with a tremendous gravity that eventually broke into enormous emotion that required his son Miguel to bring him a handkerchief. Thomas Monroe was a calmer baby than his brother had been, and he looked up at the world with Walter's dark eyes and his mother's expression of someone cataloging information for future use. The ranch had found its equilibrium. The partial sale had proved, in the end, commercially successful for Lockhart Holdings. The processing facility was profitable, the railroad connection worked, and the clean title meant no litigation clouds. Pryor had written a professional note to Theodora acknowledging that her approach had been sound, which she appreciated, and did not entirely forgive him for the letter he had sent threatening her career, though she understood it. The Perez family expanded their farming operation in 1889, a new field to the north of the old one, fed by the protected irrigation channel that Theodora had made certain was in the deed restrictions. Miguel Perez married a woman named Rosa from Albuquerque, and their first child was a girl they called Theodora, which caused great celebration and some gentle teasing, and a great deal of pride in the community. Walter Monroe turned 40 in the autumn of 1889, and Theodora organized a gathering at the ranch that was not exactly a party. He was not a party man. He had made that clear with patient honesty, but was something more important, a gathering of the people who were the living proof of what the ledger of handshake agreements had always documented. The Perez family and the Tillman family and the families from town who had depended on and contributed to what the Monroe Ranch was, and Clara and Charlie, who was now 15 and already 6 feet tall and deeply absorbed in the care of horses, and Harrison Lockhart, who came from Chicago for the third time, looking older and quieter and more genuinely present than he had in either of the previous visits. They sat outside in the October evening, the air sharp and clear, the last of the sunset going pink and orange above the mountains, and James, 4 years old, emphatic, thoroughly verbal, announced to anyone who would listen that the sunset looked like his mother's red coat, which caused considerable laughter, and Thomas, 18 months and just walking, used the occasion to fall down in the grass and look up at the stars with the expression of someone encountering infinity for the first time. Walter was beside her when the last of the guests had gone inside or home, the two of them standing at the pasture fence in the dark, the ranch quiet around them in the way it got at the end of a full day, a breathing quiet, inhabited and full. "Good day," he said. "The best," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and across the dark land the Rio Silo was running somewhere in its channel, over the rocks and through the cottonwood, past the irrigation channels and the springs and the North Ridge where the old paths ran, carrying the water that had been running through this country since long before any of them arrived and would be running long after they were gone. Stewards, not owners. That was what his father had written, and that was what she had become. A steward of this place and this life and this man and these children and this community of people who had made something worth protecting out of a piece of the high desert that would have been, in a different ending, just a transaction on a piece of paper with a signature and a pen. The pen was in a drawer now, in her office above the dry goods store. She kept it there, not as a talisman or a symbol, but simply as an object. The pen she had put down the morning Walter Monroe had told her the truth about his land, the morning she had made the first involuntary choice that led to all the other ones. She thought sometimes about what the story of her life would have been in the alternate version. She would have signed that morning. She would have returned to Chicago. She would have been excellent and organized and professionally formidable and thoroughly alone at the center of it. The Rio Silo would have been diverted. The Perez fields would have dried. The North Ridge paths would have been blocked by fence and development. All of that would have happened in the world where she picked the pen back up. She did not live in that world. She lived in this one. Charlie became a veterinarian. He finished his studies in 1895 and came back to Silo Rojo, which no one was entirely surprised by, and opened a practice that served the ranching families of the county. And he was good at it in the way Walter was good at things, with full attention and genuine care, and the patience that the animals required of him. James grew up to be exactly the boy that his parents were proud of, not because he was perfect, but because he was genuinely good in the way that the word means something, honest and fair and possessed of his mother's precision and his father's steady attention. He went to study law in Santa Fe at 18, which Theodora found both tremendously satisfying and slightly terrifying, and he came back to Silo Rojo to practice, which made the county's legal representation notably stronger and caused Emma Tillman to say that the town had upgraded itself considerably since that woman from Chicago had come to finalize a land sale 20 years ago. Thomas was the one who kept the ranch. He had his grandfather James Monroe's feeling for the land, that particular native affinity that some people have and cannot be taught, and he took over the day-to-day operations gradually and naturally as Walter's 50s came on. And he ran it with the same handshake ledger and the same honest stewardship, and expanded the water agreements to cover a new family that had come to farm the eastern section in 1896. Harrison Lockhart died in 1891, peacefully in his bed in Chicago, after a winter illness that moved faster than anyone anticipated. He left Theodora a letter and a portion of the Lockhart Holdings shares, and the letter said several things that mattered among them. You were right. You were right from the beginning. I wish I had been more interested in what you saw. He had been more interested in the end than in the beginning, and that was enough. She kept the letter with the other one, in the box in the study where the important papers were kept. Walter Monroe at 50 was still the man she had first known at 33, the same unhurried attention, the same habit of saying the true thing, the same full presence that she had learned from, and that she believed had made her better at everything, not just at love but at law and life, and the daily practice of paying attention. There were lines in his face now that had not been there when she had first ridden out to the ranch in the spring of 1883, and his dark hair was more silver than dark, and his hands had more of the years in them. She loved all of it with a specific, detailed love, the love of someone who has been paying attention for a long time and finds every new detail worth cataloging. They celebrated 20 years of the settlement in 1903, with a gathering at the ranch that drew people from across the county. The Perez family, now 2 generations deep in their farming, Miguel and Rosa's children working the expanded fields. The Tillman family with their prosperous store and their wagon road that was now an actual maintained road. The families from town who had grown up around the informal agreements and the handshake understandings that had been made formal by the work of that year. The Navajo families sent word through the seasonal migration cycle, a message passed by the families who worked the northern land, acknowledging the formalized right-of way and the springs that still ran clean. The processing facility on the southwest parcel was on its 3rd expansion by then, still operating under the deed restrictions that protected the water and the encumbrances, still functioning in the way that honest agreements function when they are made honestly in the first place. Theodora stood at the pasture fence in the evening of that gathering, alone for a moment while the gathering swelled behind her at the ranch house, and looked out across the land she had arrived to purchase and had instead been changed by. The Rio Silo caught the late light in the distance, a silver thread through the sage and grass, utterly indifferent to the history that had swirled around it and utterly beautiful for exactly that reason. She heard Walter's step behind her before she felt his hand on her shoulder. "Your son is winning an argument with the county assessor about water rights," he said. "You should probably supervise." "James is better at it than I am," she said. "I taught him everything I know and then he improved on it." "That is the best possible outcome," Walter said. She turned to look at him in the last of the light. 50 years old, silver-haired, steady-handed, real. The man who had refused to let her leave his kitchen that first morning without telling her the truth about his land. The man who had given her back the weight in her chest and made her understand that carrying the weight was the point. "I love you," she said. "I know I tell you regularly, but I want to keep telling you regularly." "I love you," he said. "I will keep telling you regularly until I cannot anymore, and then you will have to remember that I did." She took his hand the way she had on the porch the first time, years ago, and they stood at the fence in the evening with the Rio Silo somewhere ahead of them. And behind them, the voices of their children and their friends and their community rose in the warm air. And the mountains were the deep rose of the late hour, and the first stars were appearing above the eastern ridge in the sky that was, as it had always been out here, impossibly full of light. She had come to finalize a land sale. She had left once because the rancher had made her question everything. And in questioning everything, she had found the only answer that had ever mattered. That the right life was not the smooth one, not the armored one, not the one where the pen was always ready and the field of vision was carefully narrow. The right life was this messy and rooted and full, connected to the land and the river and the community and the man beside her, who had looked at her from the first morning with the honest belief that she was capable of being exactly who she actually was. She turned her face toward the mountains, toward the cooling desert air, toward the evening star just risen, and she breathed it all in, the sage and the cedar and the clean water smell of the river somewhere in the dark. And she was, in that moment and in all the moments that followed, completely and irreversibly and gratefully home.